One of the primary tools of audio engineering is compression, and using compression effectively will be one of those techniques that you'll definitely have in your tool belt as an audio engineer, and it's really going to help you get closer to a more professional sound. So let's look at some basic compression and what it's all about. So if you remember from a previous tutorial, we talked about amplitude, and amplitude meaning loudness. When we look at all the sounds that are out there, there are a few characteristics of sounds that distinguish one from another, and one of those obviously is amplitude, which we measure in decibels or dB. Now, the waveform, as you can see below, is the graphic representation of a sound pressure wave. And these waveforms allow us to visually see the acoustic intensity of a recorded sound. So we can see how intense it is, how loud it is. And the width of that waveform indicates the amount of volume. So as we're recording a track and we're turning that gain up or that level up, the bigger that waveform gets, it lets us know how loud we're actually capturing that sound during recording. And so the y-axis of a waveform, or the left side of the waveform chart here, is volume. And this is, of course, measured in decibels. And then the bottom axis of the chart represents time. So as this waveform or performance just continues to happen over time, we're able to see how this waveform reacts over time. Does it stay steady, or does it kind of bounce up and down? And that bouncing up and down of the waveform is something known as dynamic range, which is the change in volume. Okay, the change in volume up and down that happens while recording an audio source. Okay, so if we're recording vocals, or we're recording, guitar or bass, there's going to be kind of, in a lot of cases, a change where it might be louder sometimes, it might be softer sometimes. Now, there's going to typically be some amount of dynamic range during the recording, but excessive amounts of dynamic range that occur randomly make it difficult to balance the sound source with the other instruments or voices that are in the overall mix. So we have to be careful that there's not too much of that up and down in volume, or else it's hard to kind of place that sound in the mix so that it'll be consistent over time. One of the things that kind of impacts the amount of dynamic range that happens when you're recording is the experience and or skill level of the musician or vocalist. Because if you have someone that's experienced or skilled while they're recording, the dynamic range has a tendency to be more under control than someone who might be new to recording, or maybe not as skilled. Then there might be a tendency for some passages of music to get loud, some to get soft. So this chart here on the left is an example of less dynamic range. As you can see from the chart, you have this waveform that's pretty steady. It's pretty even. Now this next example represents more dynamic range, where you have a little bit louder spike here, and then it gets softer, and then it gets louder again and softer, and on and on. So it's this type of dynamic range that we really need to try to control. So why is a lot of dynamic range a problem? Well, first of all, a lot of dynamic range can make it difficult to balance the voice or instrument that you have in your mix. And so that's one of the things we have to be careful about. Also, it can be really hard to optimize the volume of the source you recorded. It's hard to turn it up to its optimal source without peaking, because those spikes could cause us to peak. So we're not really able to turn up so that the lower level passages can be heard as well. So we got to be careful about that. Those lower level passages, which are words or phrases, they can get buried in the mix if you got a lot of dynamic range, because you have to be careful how much you turn it up without peaking. So sometimes those lower levels can go unheard. It's also more difficult to get a consistent overall mix balance if your sounds are not even throughout. If you have sounds that are bouncing all over, up and down, it's hard to get a consistent mix. And if dynamic range problems exist with a lot of your sounds in the mix, the end result could be a cluttered mix with poorly defined audio sources. When you mix, you want to be able to hear all those sounds. You want them to have their own defined place within the mix. And if, everything's kind of all over the place, it's harder to do that. So how can we correct dynamic range issues? There are a few ways. One of the ways we can do it is splitting a track into multiple tracks. We call this multing, so that the volumes of inconsistent sections can be controlled individually. So if you know you got a really loud section of a vocal recording you just did, you can take that loud section, multi it out, and put it on its own track so you can control the volume of that loud passage on its own. Another way to correct dynamic range issues is riding the gain knob while recording. So while you're recording, you can be turning that gain knob down during louder sections, and turning it up during softer sections. And this is usually a smart thing to do anyway when you're recording. Once you set that level, you want to kind of respond to the performance of the vocalist. The next thing you can do is automate volume levels while mixing by using volume envelopes or real-time fader adjustment. So after you've got the recording done, you can put envelopes on the track that allow you to automatically turn down the volume at certain spots. And then finally, and what we're focused on today, one of the big ways to control dynamic range issues is through compression. And so compression is a recording technique that's used to reduce the amount of dynamic range of a recording sound. That's what compression is all about. And the compressor is the tool that we use that controls dynamic range by reducing the volume level of audio signals that exceed a preset threshold. So let's talk about that. And let's look at the parameters of a compressor. The first parameter is the threshold. The threshold of a compressor sets the level that must be exceeded to trigger the compressor. So a compressor is not just going to work all the time. You're going to be setting a threshold level that once that sound source crosses that threshold, the compressor is going to kick in. The second parameter, ratio. The ratio determines the volume reduction that occurs to the audio signal once the threshold is exceeded. And the ratio looks like 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, those types of numbers. The third parameter of a compressor is attack. The attack determines how fast the compressor takes action once triggered. So this is usually measured in milliseconds. The next parameter, release. Release determines the speed at which the compressor stops compressing once the signal goes below the threshold. And this is also measured in milliseconds. Gain, sometimes called makeup gain, is a volume control that's used to increase the overall volume of audio after compression. So once you've compressed that sound and you've kind of reduced the overall volume, you can make up that gain that you lost through compression with gain control. And finally, knee. The knee is a setting that impacts how quickly the maximum volume reduction or ratio happens once the threshold is reached. And that's also measured in decibels. Okay, so let's go ahead and apply some of these compression parameters and really look at how they work. So if we look at this waveform here to our left, we see that there's a fair bit of dynamic range, just kind of changes in volume level. It gets loud, then it gets soft, then it gets loud and soft, and so on and so forth. And this happens at times. In fact, dynamic range is fairly common. So let's look at how these compression settings would work on an example such as this. So if we start out and we look at our threshold, threshold could be represented by these dashed lines, these yellow lines. And we look at the information inside the yellow lines as being where most of that audio exists. And then there is some of that information exceeds the yellow line. And so it's that audio that exceeds the yellow line, that goes beyond it, is what's actually going to be compressed or turned down. So in this example, the threshold would be -6 decibels. Which again is represented by this dashed line. Once the audio or any audio that goes beyond that is what's going to actually be compressed. And it's going to be compressed by whatever the ratio is that we set. So if we set a ratio of 3:1, we can interpret that as 1/3. So any audio that exceeds that threshold is going to be reduced by 1/3 of its volume. Okay, so it looks something like this. After you have that ratio set, now the volume of that information outside the threshold comes down. So as you can see, you have a tighter, more consistent sound as opposed to the peaks that kind of go up and down. And so that's really the crux of what a compressor does. The attack setting basically lets us know how quickly the compressor kicks in once the threshold is exceeded. And we usually want to go for a quick attack. So 30 to 50 milliseconds would represent a quick attack, basically saying, once that threshold gets exceeded, the compressor is going to act pretty quickly. The release tells us, once the compression is complete and the sound goes back underneath that threshold, how quickly does the compressor return to the normal volume? And so usually we're going to do a slow release, say in the range of 120 to 150 milliseconds. And these attack and release settings are important because you don't want to hear that compressor working. We want that compressor to be transparent. And if we don't set the attack and release appropriately, then you'll hear the audio pumping and or breathing, and you don't want to hear that happening. The gain that you're going to set with your compressor is going to vary. It's going to be based on the output. And we'll look at a compressor, the Pro Tools compressor in a moment, and really look at how we're going to gauge our gain setting. Because once you've turned this volume down, which is what you've done with the compressor, now you have the room to be able to turn the overall volume of this entire track up. And that's going to give you kind of a bolder, more in-your-face sound. The knee, we usually hear about the knee as being hard versus soft. So once the threshold is exceeded and that ratio kicks in, that's basically going to turn down the volume of whatever is beyond the threshold. The knee basically says, how quickly does that full ratio happen? Does it immediately get dropped to 3:1 or 1/3 of its volume, and that would be a hard ratio, or does it kind of gradually drop that ratio to 3:1, which would be a soft ratio? And we can usually use somewhat of a softer knee, and in the Pro Tools compressor, we could use a factor of 7 decibels on that knee. So let's look at a little recipe here. This recipe is going to work for you. You can use this initially, and you really won't go wrong if you stick to this basic recipe while you're getting to know the compressor. And then over time, you can kind of, veer from the recipe a little bit based on the sounds. So we can use a ratio of 3:1. We can use that on a consistent basis. Now, if you're looking at a bass guitar or a kick, use a ratio of 6:1. Use a higher ratio for those low frequency instruments. The attack, we can go ahead and settle in at 50 milliseconds for your attack time. Now, if you're looking at a snare drum, make that attack 70 milliseconds. The release will use 150 milliseconds, and your knee we'll use 7 decibels for that knee. So that recipe is going to work for you. And the threshold and the gain are something that are going to depend. Those are going to depend on the actual audio that you're compressing. And again, we'll look in a moment at how we're going to end up setting those parameters as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and apply some compression to some audio tracks here to practice, the technique of compression. And so we're going to look at a multi-track recording of the AMS All-Stars, which is a project that most of our in-house or in-studio students will start out mixing. So let's start out by just taking a look at the kick track, okay? And when you go about compressing, you want to take a look at the overall waveform, and you want to look at the area of that waveform that's the thickest, or the section that's probably going to be the loudest. And you can set that up and just select that entire section, okay? And we're going to set that section to loop. Now, if you're on a Mac, you can hit Control-Click, and will see that the play button now has this loop symbol around it. If you're on a PC, you can right-click on that play button and set it up to loop. So once we've selected the region that we want to focus on, we can hit the play button, and what's going to happen is this particular section will continue to loop so we can focus on it while we do our compression. Now, the reason we want to compress the loudest section is that once we get those settings correct for the loudest sections, then we know that those settings will also work for the softer settings. But if we were to set our compression on the softer settings, then we would probably run the risk of over-compressing in terms of the louder sections. Because once we apply compression to that entire track, that's applied to the entire waveform from beginning to end, both the soft and the loud sections. So let's go over to the insert column, which you'll see right here. And we're going to go to the kick track and go to the first slot in the insert column. We're going to left click, go down to plugin, go to dynamics, and find the compressor limiter DYN3. And we're going to select that compressor. That's going to be our compressor of choice. And that's a pretty good compressor, a good multi-purpose compressor that you'll definitely get to know and use quite often. Okay. So you can see already that these meters are on the compression are already dancing around. So it's already responding to the audio that's actually going through it at this time. So why don't we start out by filling in our recipe, those parameters of the compressor that we already know. So this is a kick. So we already said for your kick and your bass instruments, we're going to use a ratio of 6:1. So I can left click in this little area here, and I can type 6 and hit enter. That's going to set up a 6:1 ratio. Now you can type that number, or you can go in and move the dial. Whichever one is most comfortable, they do the exact same thing. So we get that ratio set. Now we'll go to the attack, type our 50 milliseconds for the attack. On the release, 150 milliseconds. For our knee, 7 dB. And then in terms of our threshold, this is going to really depend. And we have a meter over here called the gain reduction meter. It's this orange meter that's dancing around here. By really looking at this orange meter, we can really determine where that threshold needs to be. What we're looking to happen is we want this orange meter to land right at about the -6 decibel point. Because what this is telling us is how much gain reduction we're getting once the sound goes beyond the threshold. And remember, that's what a compressor does. It turns down the gain. It turns down the volume of the audio that goes beyond the threshold. So when we get right around that -6 dB, that's going to be a good place for us to stop. Right now, we're going a little bit lower than we want to right now, so we're going to turn the threshold down a little bit. And when you do that, you see that this orange meter is not going as far. Now it's getting right at about that -6 dB, which is pretty much what we want. So I'm going to add a little more threshold because we're going to let it, probably go just a little beyond that -6. There we go. All right. And so you'll want to play with this, and you want to just take your time and make sure you're getting the appropriate amount of gain reduction. Okay, so I'm going to keep looking at that, monitoring, making sure that threshold is right. All right, there we go. So I'm pretty comfortable with that. It's going a little bit past the -6 dB, but it's not getting down as far as the -12 dB. So that's going to be a good number for us right now. Now, in terms of the gain, to set our gain, we're going to look at this output meter, which is this meter in the middle. This is telling us what the overall volume of the compressed signal is now. We're looking for this output meter to get right at about the -3 dB mark. And right now we're actually going beyond it. So we're okay. We're not going to add any additional gain. If you're already getting -3 decibels of output, then you can leave it alone. You can leave that gain at 0. So in this case, for the kick, we would be all done. We'd be ready to move on to our next instrument. So let's jump down and take a quick look at guitar 1. Let's do that. And we're going to go to this insert section again. On guitar 1, go to the first slot, go to plugin, dynamics, compressor limiter, DYN3. So if you look at guitar 1, it's pretty even all the way across the board. So there's really no one section that we would need to focus in on and loop. We can just let any section loop. So we're going to go through again, and we're going to set our recipe. We can keep our ratio at 3:1. Our attack, 50 milliseconds. Our release, 150 milliseconds. Our knee, 7 dB. Okay, and then again, let's take a look at gain reduction. And right now, the gain reduction is right at about -6 dB. It's pretty close. We can pull this threshold down maybe a little bit, just a little bit, to get us at that -6. There we are. And so now we're getting the gain reduction that we really are looking for. And so the next thing we're going to take a look at is the output meter. And we see that the output meter isn't quite at the -3 decibel mark. So now we can add some gain to it. Go ahead and add some volume and push that up so that this output meter gets to the -3 dB. So we ended up adding about 5.8 decibels of gain to get us there. And so in the case of this guitar, we're in good shape. We wouldn't really have to do much more in terms of compression on the guitar. And so that's all there is to it. In these beginning stages of compression, you're going to compress every track. And the thing to keep in mind when you use these recipes, pay attention to what you're compressing. If it's a bass or a kick, that ratio is going to be 6:1. If it's a snare, that attack is going to be 70 milliseconds, not 50 milliseconds. Using compression is going to be a great tool that's going to enable you to really control the dynamic range that exists in your recordings. And as time goes on, it's going to allow you to have tracks and recordings that are bolder and more in your face.